US President Donald Trump has doubled tariffs on India from 25 to 50%. Trump's executive order cites threats to US national security because of India's purchase of oil from Russia. It is the highest tariff US has imposed on any country and is the same as Brazil. But the additional 25% tariff does not go into effect immediately. There is a 21-day window. So the additional tariff goes into effect on 27th August. And he is not stopping at that. His criticism of India for trading with Russia continues. He even accuses India of selling much of the Russian oil it purchases in the open market for big profits and not caring about Ukrainian deaths by the Russian war machine. If we look closely, Trump is using a blow hot, blow cold strategy, mixing aggression with conciliation.
Well, I understand India no longer is going to be buying oil from Russia. That's what I heard. I don't know if that's right or not, but that's a good step. We'll see what happens.
But India is standing its ground and has hit back at Trump's criticism. India calls the additional tariff unfair, unjustified, and unreasonable. That leads us to ask, is the West being hypocritical on the question of trade with Russia, and how should India respond to Trump's threats? Hello and welcome to Connecting the Dots. I'm Unman Paracharya. Let's connect the dots. As Trump tries to dictate terms, India is showing it is no pushover. In this official statement, India's Ministry of External Affairs exposes not just American, but Western hypocrisy. India says the US itself continues to import from Russia uranium hexafluoride for its nuclear industry, palladium for its electric vehicles, and also fertilizers and chemicals. On European Union's trade with Russia, India points out that in 2024, EU had a bilateral trade of 67.5 billion euros in goods. And in 2023, EU traded services worth 17.2 billion euros. This is more than India's total trade with Russia that year or in the later years. That's not all. If we look at just European imports of LNG from Russia, they were a record 16.5 million tons. That's higher than the last record of 15.2 million tons in 2022. What's more, Europe-Russia trade is not limited to energy alone. It also includes fertilizers, mining products, chemicals, iron and steel, machinery, and transport equipment. This simply means that nations criticizing India for trading with Russia are themselves trading with Russia. One must also note here that unlike India, neither the US trade with Russia nor Europe's trade with Russia was a vital national compulsion. India began importing Russian crude because traditional supplies were diverted to Europe after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in February 2022, and India needed predictable and affordable energy costs for the Indian consumer. While Trump has opposed India buying oil from Russia in the past, this is the first time he has criticized India for selling the purchased oil in the open market for big profits. To be sure, India does not export crude oil, but it does export refined petroleum fuels. India imports discounted Russian oil, refines it into fuels like petrol, diesel, and jet fuel, and then exports those fuels to international markets, including Europe, which has otherwise banned Russian petroleum imports. So who gains from this crude oil trade between India and Russia? European countries, among others.
Energy prices shot up after Russia invaded Ukraine and began the war in 2022, February 2022. And this was because the Europeans started looking for alternative sources of energy, just started looking for energy in the Gulf states, which is where India buys energy from. So as a result, a pathway had to be found for Russian crude to be made available to the rest of the world. And India became that pathway with the concurrence of Western governments, including the US administration.
India insists there is nothing illegitimate in its oil imports and fuel exports, as Russian oil is not under any sanctions. There is only a price cap mechanism instituted by the US and its allies. US and much of the West, while wanting to curtail Russia's revenue from oil sales, did not want its supply to go off the international market for the sake of stability of global energy markets. That is why, instead of placing Russian oil under sanctions, the price cap on Russian crude was introduced when Joe Biden was US president. Russia is among the top oil producers globally. Its oil exports going off the market could push up international oil prices significantly. Countries like India, which have been buying Russian oil, have argued that their purchases have kept oil prices under check.
The important question is India buying Russian crude oil illegitimately? Is it breaching the price cap? Is it buying sanctioned oil? There is no evidence of that happening. There is no one who's suggesting that India is breaching the price cap, that India is doing something illegal. Given that, I don't see why and how India can refuse to buy Russian oil forever.
In fact, the Indian statement this time around is not a first. India's statement has been consistent since the war in Ukraine broke out. It has been reiterated by Indian officials and ministers in public and in private to the American and European governments in the last 3 years. Remember how Dr. Jaishankar had blown Europe's double standards on energy purchases from Russia into smithereens in 2022 in this joint press conference with the then US administration officials held in Washington, D.C.
I noticed you refer to oil purchases. If you are looking at energy purchases from Russia, I would suggest that your attention should be focused on Europe, which probably we do buy some energy which is necessary for our energy security. But I suspect, looking at the figures, probably our total purchases for the month would be less than what Europe does in an afternoon. So you might want to think about it.
And now, amid the ongoing spat with the West on trade with Russia, Dr. Jaishankar is signaling to the West that fairness is a must and domination is a clear no.
We live in complicated and uncertain times. Our collective desire is to see a fair and representative global order, not one dominated by a few.
The current controversy brings up memories of Washington's infamous 1970s tilt during the Richard Nixon administration, when the US tried to bully New Delhi during the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War by sending the US 7th Fleet to the Bay of Bengal with the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise. In the present case, India says it would take all necessary measures to safeguard its national interests and economic security. Though India's oil imports from Russia had started falling even before Trump's latest tirade against India on Russian trade, Trump's threat is unlikely to affect India's decision to source crude from Moscow as long as it is cheaper than the alternatives. The government of India has so far not made any move to pull back Indian oil refiners from Russian crude that comes at a steep discount compared to purchases from West Asia or the US. So why is Donald Trump pressuring India to not trade with Russia? No doubt, there is renewed pressure from the US and other Western powers on Russia's top trading partners to make them cut down on imports from Russia. This is also indirect pressure being mounted by the West on Russia to force it to end the Ukraine war. For Donald Trump per se, who wants to end the Russia-Ukraine war within days, this is an opportune time to pressure countries like India and China over their Russian imports, given the trade negotiations that these countries are holding with the US. The one must note here that China, not India, is the largest buyer of Russian oil. In 2024, China imported $62.6 billion worth of Russian oil compared to India's $52.7 billion. But Trump is more critical of India than China these days. Perhaps he is unwilling to criticize China because of geopolitical calculations. So to sum it up, While Trump's threat ignores market realities, misrepresents trade data, and undermines a key partnership in the Indo-Pacific, India's oil trade with Russia has taken place with full transparency and broad understanding with the United States. India decides for itself. It's called strategic autonomy, be it on Operation Sindoor or on trade with its reliable strategic partner Russia that has stood with India through thick and thin. It was January 2023. Chaos broke out in Brazil's capital, Brasilia. Supporters of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro stormed and vandalized government buildings. They attacked the National Congress, Supreme Federal Court, and even the Presidential Palace. They smashed windows, broke furniture, and clashed with the police. But why did this happen? It all began with the 2022 presidential election. The supporters of Bolsonaro refused to accept the results of the election. They believed that the election had been rigged and that current President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva had won unfairly.
O Brasil precisa de segurança.
The idea was to pressure the military to step in and overturn the election. They wanted to prevent Lula from taking office and reinstall Bolsonaro as president. Now fast forward to 2025. On August 4, Brazil's Supreme Court placed Bolsonaro under house arrest. He is currently on trial and accused of trying to carry out a coup to stay in power after losing the 2022 election. Now, the house arrest order came after he was accused of breaking court rules by using his son's social media to incite attacks on the Supreme Court and call for foreign intervention. Authorities searched his home. His phones were seized. Visits have been banned. Only his lawyers and close family are allowed to visit. And more interestingly, an ankle monitor has been put on Bolsonaro so that his movements can be tracked and he cannot flee the country. Prosecutors say Bolsonaro led a criminal group plotting to stay in power after losing the 2022 election. The plan allegedly included assassinations of President Lula and Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. It also aimed to arrest high officials and shut down key institutions. Investigators launched Operation Counter Coup. They used wiretaps, made arrests, and found meeting videos, all pointing to a larger plan involving military support and fake news campaigns to undermine the election results. But Bolsonaro denies everything. He calls the trial a witch hunt and says he is being targeted for political reasons. His lawyers plan to appeal the house arrest order.
There's no legal basis for him to force President Bolsonaro to control what third parties post on his social media. He didn't ask me to post. He had no intention of circumventing any precautionary measure. I did it because I am aware that I have the freedom to do this.
Opposition lawmakers in Congress staged a protest over Bolsonaro's house arrest. They covered their mouths with tape. After the house arrest order, Bolsonaro supporters gathered outside his residence.
We will not be silent in the face of everything that is happening. Brazil has awakened and we are in the streets again. We are fighting for freedom before it was one for all. Now we are all for one.
Meanwhile, security has since been tightened across Brasilia to prevent another attack like in 2023. Now, a US connection to this. But before that, see these visuals. you remember, these visuals are of the US Capitol attack in 2021. Now you may wonder why we are showing this now. If you think carefully, what happened in Brazil in January 2023 looks very similar to what happened in the United States on January 6, 2021. In both cases, supporters of right-wing then former presidents Donald Trump in the US and Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil stormed their country's top government buildings. In the US, rioters broke into the Capitol to stop Congress from confirming Joe Biden's win. In Brazil, crowds invaded the Congress, Supreme Court and presidential palace, demanding a military takeover to overturn Lula's election. Both groups claimed the elections were rigged or stolen. Both events were organized online with help from politicians, influencers, and ex-officials. Many experts say Brazil's attack was inspired by what happened in Washington. Now cut to the present times. This situation has caused a major diplomatic rift between Brazil and the United States, specifically with the Trump administration. US President Donald Trump, a political ally of Bolsonaro, has condemned the trials. Trump imposed a 50% tariff on Brazilian goods, linking it to what he calls an unjust prosecution. He has also criticized the trial as a witch hunt and demands it end.
Do you plan to talk to the Brazilian president about the tariff?
Maybe at some point I'll talk to him. Right now I'm not. They're treating President Bolsonaro very unfairly. He's a good man. You know, I know him well. I negotiated with him. He was a very tough negotiator, and I can tell you he was a very honest man, and he loved the people of Brazil. He was a very tough guy to negotiate with. I shouldn't like him because he was very tough in negotiation, but he was also very honest. And I know the honest ones, and I know the crooked ones.
The Trump administration also sanctioned Justice Alexandre de Moraes under the Magnitsky Act, accusing him of censorship and human rights violations. US officials revoked his visa and hinted at more actions against other justices. These moves have deepened tension between the US and Brazil. President Lula and Brazil's government strongly object, calling the sanctions an unacceptable interference. Bolsonaro's trial is ongoing. A verdict is expected before the end of 2025. If convicted, he could face years in prison. One thing is for sure, Bolsonaro's trial and house arrest mark a significant moment for Brazil's democratic history. That's all in this edition of Connecting the Dots. We'll see you in the next episode with more raging issues. Until then, it's a goodbye from all of us in the Delhi newsroom. This is Munmun Bhattacharya signing off. Take care and stay safe.